you all for being here. It's wonderful to see you all. I'm Brianna Conrey. This is Piano, an all-woman show. And as you may have already guessed, this is going to be a little bit different than your typical classical music concert. For one thing, there's going to be a lot more talking. Oh wait, there's already been a lot more talking. There's also going to be, hopefully, some laughter, maybe a little more laughter than a typical classical concert, maybe a few tears. I cry at classical concerts a lot, so maybe that's typical for you too, I don't know, we'll see. But anyway, the way that this differs probably the most is that all the music we're going to hear tonight is going to be music written by women composers. So to get to tonight, and to kind of, I want to describe a little bit of how this show came to be. So to understand that, we have to go back just for a very, very brief moment to the dark days of COVID. Sorry, we won't stay there for very long, I promise. So about a year into the COVID lockdowns, I turned 40. And let's just say I didn't get the party I wanted. What I did get was a lot of time to reflect and just think about what I was doing with my time, what I wanted to do when things opened back up. And, you know, I thought a lot about the piano, I thought a lot about music. These have been huge, important pieces of my life ever since I can remember. And at some point I realized I'd never once learned any music composed by a woman for solo piano. And I actually think that's not particularly unusual for a classical musician, for a classical pianist. But it became really important to me. I felt like it was really important to change that for myself. And so I started doing a lot of reading. I tried to find sheet music scores to play through. I looked for recordings, which were often pretty hard to find. But just the more I found, the more I was inspired by what I was finding. And I was specifically looking not necessarily at women composers who are writing today, of which there are many and who are writing incredible music, but I was really, really interested in historically learning about the women who had sort of come before me and come before all of us at the piano, and who had, their lives had sort of intertwined with male composers that we all know a lot about. I wanted to know who were the women sort of composing at the same time as these men. And, you know, what I found is, these women, not only did they write really beautiful music, which still deserves to be heard much more than it is today, but also their stories are incredibly inspiring. So, they faced many of the obstacles that unfortunately many women still face today, including sexism, sometimes intersecting with racism, having trouble being taken seriously as professionals, having difficulty balancing being artists and also having their own family life. And also just obstacles of feeling like they had difficulties sort of believing in themselves, right? What we might call imposter syndrome today, like feeling like maybe I'm not good enough to be doing this. And yet they chose to compose anyway. And so, so this show is really my way of giving voice to these women, to both their stories and their music. And I hope that, like I have, that I hope that you also find it really inspiring to learn more about them. So, to get started with our program, let's talk about Élizabeth-Claude Jacquet La Guerre. So she was a composer way back in the late 1600s to early 1700s. And it might seem surprising that there were women composing back then for, at the time it would have been harpsichord, not piano. But what you find when you go back before, say, the mid-1800s or so, is that women who were composing kind of belonged to two different groups. So there were women who basically learned music as a trade. Like their family, they came from families of musicians, they grew up with music, and a lot of them got to practice music professionally. And then there were also women who grew up in sort of ultra-wealthy families and who had access to, also had access to sort of the best musical training available. Ironically, many of them were not actually able to practice sort of publicly as professional musicians. They had more sort of private, domestically focused kind of careers, but many of them did compose also. So Élizabeth-Claude Jacquet de la Guerre was one of the women who belonged to a family of musicians. Her family was a family of harpsichord makers based in Paris. She was a child prodigy. That's a very common theme that we're going to hear again and again tonight. By the age of 5, she had performed in the court of King Louis XIV, the Sun King of France. By age 14, she actually joined Louis XIV's court as a court musician. And so she spent her time performing and composing for the court, basically. When she was 19, she got married to another court musician, Marianna Guerre, who was an organist. And the two of them got to basically stay in Paris while the court was relocating to Versailles sort of year-round. So they kind of escaped that fate. They got to remain in Paris and to continue practicing their music. And so Marianna Guerre, her husband was the organist at Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, and Elizabeth was basically teaching and composing. And she published actually quite a bit of her music. She was known as a brilliant improviser. She would improvise at the harpsichord and was widely sort of renowned for that. She also wrote music in a variety of genres, including she wrote what's considered to be the first opera written by a woman, which unfortunately has not survived. That's another common theme, unfortunately, that we'll hear tonight. But some pieces of hers that did survive were 6 suites written for harpsichord. Now, a suite at the time, continuing on, is sort of a collection of pieces in that era, the Baroque era of music, which is kind of like the time of Bach and Handel and Scarlatti and so on. A suite is sort of a collection of often music pieces that are short pieces in the same or related key, a lot of times artistic treatments of dance forms. So the one I'm going to play for you is a selection from a suite that was written in 1687, and this is called Chaconne l'Inconstante, and it's what they call a character piece from that suite. So Chaconne is basically a set of variations over a bass line, and l'inconstante here, it's like inconstant, it probably means inconstant lover, or that's kind of the reference probably. We are talking about the French court after all. And so the way that's expressed in the music is it kind of alternates between 2 different characters. So there's kind of a major key, kind of majestic refrain, which is kind of monophonic, so it's kind of like one melodic line that you might be able to follow, and then it alternates with this set of variations that's in sort of the minor key. It's more polyphonic, like multiple voices. I find this piece to be very catchy, which applies to a lot of Jacquet de la Guerre's music, and maybe sounds weird to apply to music that's over 300 years old. But let's have a listen, you can see what you think. Here's Chaconne l'Inconstante by Élizabeth-Claude Jacquet de la Guerre, written in 1687 when Bach was 2 years old. Thank you so much. So our next composer, Marianna Martines, takes us into the classical era of music. So the era of Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven. And I ran across her story very early in my research for this project. And when I learned about her, I could not believe I had never heard of her before. So Marianna Martines was from Vienna. Her father was the chief of staff for the papal embassy in Vienna. And they lived in this row house in Vienna. Bear with me, this is relevant, I promise. So in these row houses, they would have sort of multiple families living in them usually. And in those days before elevators, the lower floors were sort of for the higher classes. The upper floors were sort of lower classes or lower income families. And so Marianna Martinez's family, they were kind of on maybe the second and third floors or something of their row house. And they lived with their father's friend, Metastasio, who was this itinerant Italian poet. And he had no children of his own, so he took a keen interest in the education of the Martinez children, especially Marianna, who was exceptionally bright. So Metastasio saw to it that she learned how to speak, read, and write in 4 languages, so English, French, German, and Spanish, or in Italian. And she also learned how to sing. And the way she learned how to sing was actually from Metastasio looking around their row house and trying to find her a singing teacher. He's like, well, let's look in my immediate neighborhood. Maybe there's somebody here who could teach her. So it turned out Niccolò Porpora was an Italian opera composer, and he taught her how to sing. And then Metastasio thought, she's very talented in music, and maybe she should learn how to play the harpsichord. Is there anyone around here who can teach her the harpsichord? And so he looked all around, and he looked up and down, and way, way, way up to the garret apartment, the attic of their row house. It turned out up there was a struggling young composer who was pretty good at the harpsichord. So Metastasio made a deal with him. Okay, I'll pay your rent in exchange for you giving Marianna lessons on the harpsichord. And he did that for a few years. You may have heard of that struggling young composer. His name was Joseph Haydn. So, so Marianna's learned, she learned how to play the harpsichord from Haydn. She was also composing quite a bit. She was a favorite at the imperial court, and she was a favorite of the Empress Maria Theresa. She would perform there frequently. She also, in her 20s, was inducted to the Musical Academy in Bologna, which was very prestigious. Mozart was actually also a member, and she actually wrote this beautiful entrance piece for that, a setting for choir and orchestra of the Dixit Dominus, which incredibly was never actually heard in her lifetime, although now it's considered to be really her masterpiece. After some time, so Metastasio eventually passed away. He left Marianna and her sister his estate because he, again, didn't have any children. And she and her sister never married because that would have meant sort of giving up a considerable amount of freedom at the time. Instead, they ran a singing school for young ladies, and they held these musical salons that became quite famous. In fact, Mozart was a frequent guest at their salons, and it's thought that he and Marianna used to play duets together frequently, and that he may have actually composed some four-handed sonatas to play with Marianna Martines. Some even say that one of Marianna Martinez's early masses actually, or one of her masses that she wrote actually may have inspired one of Mozart's early masses. And this kind of makes sense. I mean, she was 12 years older than him, so he probably looked up to her. So we know of about 200 works that Marianna Martines composed, and about a third of them have survived, which is actually the most of any woman from the classical era. She wrote somewhere over 30 piano sonatas, or still harpsichord sonatas at that point, and only 3 of them survived. I'm going to play one of those 3 for you. It's in G major. It's really, It's a really great piece. It's very it's got this sort of brilliant technique that you need for the outer movements. It almost feels like Scarlatti or something. It's kind of like this early classic style, but it's kind of like building on that kind of style. The middle movement is slow and lyrical and very beautiful. It kind of really shows her interest in vocal writing. So here is Marianna Martinez's Sonata in G major. so much. Not much is known about the life of our next composer, Maria Hester Park. So she worked in sort of the late 1700s, early 1800s. So she was also part of the classical era, but kind of later than Marianna Martines. She was born in England. She was from London. Her father was actually an oboist in the London Symphony. And she grew up performing quite a bit. She was also a child prodigy. And she composed from an early age as well. She kind of gave up performing after her marriage at age 27, but she continued to compose and to teach. And she was actually very popular as both a composer and a teacher, so much so that she was the primary breadwinner for her household, which was herself, her husband, and their 6 children. And she and her husband were friends with Haydn. There's Haydn again. He seems to have been a friendly guy. And that's literally about all we know about her. So in my research, the quote I kept coming across regarding Maria Hester Park was that she made her living composing the kind of music performed by Jane Austen heroines. Is anyone here a Jane Austen fan? Okay, I see a few out there anyway. I'm a Jane Austen fan too. And but I have to say, to me, that quote sounds just a little bit disparaging, maybe. At least it sounds like it's something that makes me want to learn more, right? So let's unpack that a little bit. Well, okay, so let's take it literally to begin with. So it turns out Jane Austen's sister-in-law actually owned sheet music written by Maria Hester Park. So in fact, Jane Austen may have actually heard or even played some of Park's music. Maybe she did picture her heroines playing it. But then anyone who is a Jane Austen fan might remember that music, and particularly the piano, plays a huge role in a lot of Jane Austen's books. So sometimes it's brought in to sort of illustrate character, like Mary Bennet, the sort of tiresome, pedantic middle sister in Pride and Prejudice, plays the piano for far too long at a party, and that's part of illustrating her character. Or Jane Fairfax is, well, so this is actually more of a character, a plot point, or moving the plot along. In Emma, Jane Fairfax receives a piano as a gift from a secret admirer. That's an important plot point. So why did the piano show up so much in Jane Austen's work? Well, in those days before Spotify and smart speakers, the only way to have music in your household was to play it yourself, right? To make the music yourself. And women in particular were encouraged to learn how to play the piano as part of sort of entertaining their families and their households. And many of them became quite accomplished. In fact, if some of you might have studied piano and studied Mozart or Beethoven or Haydn's sonata, and you might have noticed that many of those sonatas written by those male composers were actually dedicated to women. Those women were often their students and were often very accomplished players as well. So I guess I would say if Maria Hester Park wrote music, the kind of music that might have been played by Jane Austen heroines, well, so did Mozart and Haydn and Beethoven. In any case, I think Park's music is really delightful. It's really a lot of fun to play. It has a lot of elements just of classical music that I personally really enjoy playing on the piano. So it's got nice melodies, it has nice passage work, like scales and things like that. It's got a lot of humor, and it's just really a lot of fun to play and hopefully to listen to as well. So I'm going to play one of Maria Hester Park's sonatas. This is a sonata in E-flat major, and again it has 3 movements like the last one, and the first and third movements are kind of faster. The third movement is actually pretty funny once we get there, and it's in the middle there's this nice interlude of a very beautiful slow movement. So here's Maria Hester Park's sonata in E-flat major. Thank you so much. So the last composer of this part of the program is Fanny Mendelssohn-Hensel. And how many people may have heard of her? Anyone? Oh, okay, a few. Yeah, so she was actually the sister of the famous conductor and composer Felix Mendelssohn. So, like Felix, so Fanny and Felix obviously were brother and sister, so they were born into the same family, which was a highly cultured and well-off family in Berlin. Their grandfather was the great German Jewish philosopher Moses Mendelssohn, and their mother, Leah, was from a long line of Bach enthusiasts. And in fact, when Fanny was born, her mother, Leah, wrote a letter to her family to let them know about the great news of the baby's birth, and she said, "The baby has Bachian fingers." Which meant just like these long, thin fingers that baby would be good for playing Bach fugues with, which actually turned out to be the case. So Fanny was a child prodigy in music, as was Felix. Fanny was 4 years older than Felix, but the two of them both had just the best possible musical training. Their family was absolutely delighted with their musical talent and did everything they could to encourage them. The two of them were really almost, you could think of them as artistic twins. They were each other's first inspiration and best critic, and they often had eerily similar musical ideas, even from a great distance apart. It's thought that some people may have heard of Felix Mendelssohn's Songs Without Words. It's like a whole sort of little genre of music, and it's thought that the two of them, Felix and Fanny, may have come up with Songs Without Words as a musical game that they were playing with each other. But so knowing how close they were and how talented both of them were musically makes kind of what happened next all the more poignant and difficult to hear, I think, for a modern audience. So Felix, of course, went on to international fame as a composer and conductor, whereas Fanny was told as she sort of entered her mid-teens that her music could really only be an ornament to her domestic life. So she did her best to operate within that constraint. And at times she kind of like stretched and almost burst that constraint at its seams, let's say. So, for example, she used to hold these salons at her house. And I had heard about that. I kind of pictured maybe a couple dozen friends coming over, listening to a little music, having a nice social gathering together. And well, no, it really wasn't quite like that. It was more like every other Sunday afternoon for many years, she would invite over 200 people to her house. It was basically a semi-public concert series, and they would sort of stage readings of entire cantatas or operas or concertos. Fanny would pick out the program, she would recruit the musicians, do the rehearsals. She often conducted from the piano. She would play the piano and conduct from the piano. They played music by Bach and Beethoven and Mozart and by Fanny and Felix Mendelssohn both. And these were really celebrated and amazing sort of events. As Fanny grew older, in fact, as she was approaching the age of 40, she sort of craved more and more the sort of professional recognition that would come with publishing her music that she spent so much time composing. And she had wanted to publish for a long time, but her brother was very against it for complex reasons, but still, he was very much against it. She wanted his approval before she went forward. She finally decided when she was close to 40 that she was like, you know what, I'm gonna do this no matter what my brother thinks. I'm gonna publish my music, which at the time, that was not something that women sort of her social standing would have typically done. And you know, it ended up that Felix was actually very supportive of her once she decided to publish, but unfortunately and very tragically, she died at age 41 of a massive stroke. We now know that she wrote about 450 works, of which only a very small fraction were actually published. Most of them are kind of like almost miniatures, like small forms, like solo piano pieces, songs or Lieder. Her brother Felix actually said that he thought that she wrote some of the finest Lieder in the German language. She also, though, wrote pieces for choir and orchestra. She wrote one of the first string quartets known to have been composed by a woman as well. So the piece I'm going to perform for you tonight by Fanny Mendelssohn was actually not published during her lifetime. It is from this amazing collection that she wrote, this cycle of pieces called Das Jahr, the year. And basically, this is, it consists of a short piece sort of for every month of the year. And it takes about an hour to perform. Are you ready? Just kidding, I'm just gonna play one of the months from the year. But it's especially tragic, this was never published because it actually exists in two competing versions. So the first version is from 1841. Fanny actually gave it to her husband as a Christmas gift. And that version was eventually published in 1989. Okay, and then the next version, Fanny and her husband actually revised the first version together. So Fanny kind of revised the music so it was more connected from piece to piece, and it was really more of a true cycle. And her husband was actually an artist, and he drew these gorgeous pencil sketches, sort of illustrating each of the months. And then the two of them together inscribed each month with a line of poetry. And they chose different colored pastel paper to sort of print each month on. And actually, I have a reproduction of this manuscript here, so you should take a look at it during intermission if you get a chance. I think it's on the table back in the back. But basically, in 1989, members of the Mendelssohn, after the first version of the year was published, members of the Mendelssohn family were like, oh, that's kind of like something that we have sitting in the living room, like in this big stack of music, manuscripts. Apparently, this had been passed down in the Mendelssohn family along with some manuscripts by Felix Mendelssohn. At some point, the family cast lots, and the losing branch got Fanny's manuscript of the year. And they were so upset about it, they just kept it in a stack of papers, sitting in their living room, basically. But they eventually realized, oh, wait a second, maybe this is actually something interesting, to scholars. And so the revised version was published in 1998. So the piece I'm going to be playing for you is actually from the original version. It's June. This is a serenade. And the reason I've picked it is because it's kind of the only piece that does not appear in the revised version. So it was completely replaced in the revised version, almost like Fanny had other plans for it. Like maybe it belonged, she was thinking to publish it on its own some other time. And it's absolutely gorgeous. I feel like it starts out feeling like this miniature. It starts out with kind of on a small scale, and then at some point it just breaks free and flies. So this is June by Fanny Mendelssohn. This will be followed by a short intermission.
Hello, welcome back. Our next composer, Clara Schumann, is maybe a name that some people have heard also. Okay, I see a few have heard of Clara Schumann. So she was one of the greatest pianists to ever live. And she actually had a concert career spanning more than 6 decades, including most of the Romantic era of music, so much of the 19th century. And I've been obsessed with Clara Schumann since I was in 6th grade. So my piano teacher told me that that she was the reason why I had to memorize my music when I performed it in recital. And you know, I figured if she had had such an influence on generations of piano students, you know, after her lifetime, she must be pretty interesting. And actually, I even chose her as the topic for a school project, which in middle school we had to choose a historical figure to write a play about, and I chose Clara Schumann. So back then I read a lot of books about her, well, actually I read all 2 books about her that were in the library, which I reread for this project. And it was pretty interesting coming back to them, you know, with an adult perspective versus, you know, sort of preteen one. So she was also a child prodigy, like many of the composers that we're going to hear from tonight. And she was primarily trained by her father, Friedrich Wieck, who was a piano teacher. And Friedrich subscribed to John Locke's tabula rasa theory of education, the philosopher John Locke. And this was basically blank slate. Like, you could basically take any child, in this case, for Friedrich, he thought you could take any child and train them to be, you know, a good pianist. And so he set out to, of course, experiment on his own child in sort of demonstrating that. And so he set about to do that with Clara. And she must have far surpassed his expectations. So she concertized all over Europe as a child. Friedrich actually taught her a lot about managing her own concert career, which served her well throughout her lifetime. She became quite an astute businesswoman. At some point, she fell in love with her father's star pupil, Robert Schumann. And Friedrich was adamantly against the match, to the point that the couple actually had to sue for the right to marry. And in fact, a friend of mine told me that today, September 12th, is the Schumann's anniversary. So they were married on September 12th in 1840, one day before Clara Schumann turned 21. So when I was a preteen and I heard about this, you know, how Friedrich Wieck opposed this match so adamantly, right, I was just indignant. I was like, why would he stand in the way of true love, right, and young love? But as an adult, I can kind of see his point, at least a little. I mean, he was a really difficult man, don't get me wrong. And, you know, and they really were in love, and they had a wonderful and rich life together in many, many ways. But you know, I think Friedrich probably saw that Clara might be giving up quite a bit in terms of her creative life in getting married to this, you know, brilliant and extremely creative, but also very unstable man, Robert Schumann. So, and indeed, Clara had to live through a lot of tragedy. Basically, for example, 4 out of their 8 children did not survive. Well, they died before Clara. And Robert became increasingly unstable and unable to hold on to a job. He was unfortunately suffering from the effects of tertiary syphilis, and you know, basically ended up having to be institutionalized. And you know, throughout this time, Clara had to support the family through her concertizing. And before her marriage, she actually composed quite a bit, and she had even gained some important recognition as a composer, including ironically, from Felix Mendelssohn, who you know, conducted some of her works and was kind of a champion of Clara Schumann. But she had a lot of self-doubt around her composition. So there's this sort of kind of well-known-ish diary entry that she wrote when she was 20 years old, saying something like, "No woman has yet succeeded at being a composer. Why should I be the one?" So, throughout her marriage, she actually had very little opportunity to compose. So basically, the family only had enough money to have one piano in their house, and Robert got priority for it for his composition. And Clara had to use all her time with the piano to keep up her technique because that was the family's livelihood. And eventually, they were able to afford a place with 2 pianos. And then she literally had a room of her own and was able to compose again, and she did for a few years. And basically during that time, she also met Johannes Brahms, who was Robert Schumann's star student. And the two of them developed a great friendship and in some way or other, a great love. And I'm sorry to disappoint you that I'm not going to elucidate or be able to figure out, what exactly transpired between them. But certainly Brahms said that Clara was the inspiration behind all his greatest melodies. And they were a support and great friends to each other throughout their lives. So actually the pieces that I'm going to play for you tonight are from a set of romances, Opus 21 from Clara Schumann, that she dedicated to Brahms. And he actually performed the first one of these in public. And the first one is very deeply emotional. It was written on a day when Brahms was visiting Robert Schumann in the mental institution, the asylum where he was institutionalized. And Clara was unable to go because she basically had been barred from visiting Robert because it was thought to upset him too much. So she stayed home and composed this piece, basically. And then you'll be happy to know that the other selection I'll play by Clara Schumann is a little lighter. It's kind of a study in perpetual motion, but it also has a lot of just really lovely kind of lyricism and, just the use of different, it's very lovely, and it very much expresses Clara Schumann's interest both in, creating things that were entertaining and that spoke to people, but also things that spoke to people not just at the level of being entertaining, but at a more emotional level. So these are 2 of Clara Schumann's romances, Opus 21. Thank you. Thank you. So our next composer is the first American composer on the program, Amy Beach. So I know you're probably tired of hearing about child prodigies by now. So I have good news for you. Amy Beach was an infant prodigy. By the age of 1, she could accurately hum 40 songs in the original key she had heard them in. She had perfect pitch. By the time she was 2 or 3, she would harmonize with her mother, who was singing lullabies to her at night. Her mother had training as a singer and a pianist, and so she kind of took on Amy's early training. And then the family moved from New Hampshire to Boston when Amy was about 8, and that opened up just an amazing world of opportunities to Amy. This was sort of the late 1800s, early 1900s. So Amy was just the darling of Boston's musical scene. And she basically got really amazing teachers. She got to go to all kinds of concerts. She was learning how to compose. And she even, this is one of my favorite little tidbits about her, when she was 12, she joined a book club that continued to meet for the next 75 years. It was like a girls' book club in Boston that had just formed and gotten started when she was living there. So she formed lifelong friendships as well. When she was 16, Amy debuted with the Boston Symphony Orchestra, and she toured around for a couple years after that. And then at age 18, she got married to Dr. Henry Harris Aubrey Beach, who was 24 years her senior. And he was a world-renowned surgeon, actually, and he was very wealthy. And he also was a huge, huge fan of Amy's music in certain ways. So he did not want her performing in public. He did not want her studying with tutors or anything. So she became sort of entirely self-taught from that point forward. But on the other hand, he did encourage her to spend as much time as possible composing. So she devoted basically all her energy at that point to becoming a composer. And she composed for all kinds of instrumentation, including lots of solo piano work. She considered herself first and foremost a pianist. She also composed a lot of songs, and she was very, very popular as a songwriter. In fact, in 1892, she wrote this song called Ecstasy that was so popular that she actually was able to build herself a cottage on Cape Cod using the royalties. And she also, in I think 1896, she had written this symphony, the Gaelic Symphony, and that was actually premiered by the Boston Symphony Orchestra, which is the first time an American symphony orchestra had played anything written by a woman. So basically, in around 1910, Amy's husband passed away, and from that point forward, she decided that she was actually going to go out into the world and travel and give lectures and teach. And basically, she took great pleasure in all that. She also spent a lot of time as an artist as a fellow at the MacDowell Colony in New Hampshire. And she really enjoyed mentoring younger people, especially women. And she continued to be very popular throughout her lifetime. And so the piece that I'm going to play for you by Amy Beach is from a set of sketches, Opus 15. And this piece is called Dreaming. And so all of these pieces, there's like 4 pieces in Opus 15. They're all sort of these short sketches. They each have a line of French poetry that they're inscribed with. And the line for this one is from Victor Hugo, and it's Tu me parles du fond d'un rêve. You speak to me from the depths of a dream. And this is an absolutely gorgeous piece. To me, in some ways, it kind of epitomizes like romantic writing for the piano. It's very lush and chromatic and passionate. It has this great, very beautiful melody. It's almost over the top, like almost sentimental, but it's just so beautiful that it really spoke to me, and I hope you'll enjoy it as well. Here's Dreaming by Amy Beach. Thank you. And now for something completely different. So, who in the audience has heard of the next composer, Chiquinha Gonzaga? Oh, that's wonderful. Okay, so you're from Brazil. Yeah, so she's like a Brazilian composer. Yeah, wonderful, wonderful. So I first heard of Chiquinha Gonzaga from my friend Juni, who's here tonight and who's from Brazil. I had the pleasure of getting to play at a house party at Ediciones when I was first starting this project, and people were really interested in learning about, you know, these different women composers, and there were a lot of people from Brazil at the party, and several of them said to me, "Do you know about Chiquinha Gonzaga? She's this amazing Brazilian composer from the late 1800s, early 1900s, who's very, very popular to this day." And so I started learning about Chiquinha Gonzaga and learned, you know, some of her music. And Edizione, this is for you. So Chiquinha Gonzaga was born in Rio de Janeiro, and her father was a white military man, and her mother was the daughter of enslaved people of mixed racial ancestry, so probably black and indigenous and white. And at the time, Rio de Janeiro had about half of the population was actually enslaved people, mostly of African descent. And so Chiquinha grew up just with the education of, she was sort of tutored by private tutors, including in music. And, you know, she had this great education and this good family and all this stuff, but she was considered to be very rebellious. And her family decided that she maybe needed to be tamed by marrying her off. So they married her off at age 16 to a military man of 24. It didn't work out well. Let's start with that. It was not a happy marriage, and it also didn't tame her, in case anyone was worried about that. So basically, when she got married, her father knew how much she liked music, and so he gave her a piano as a wedding gift. Now, at the time, the piano was so popular in Rio de Janeiro that there were pianos like on every corner. Every house that could possibly afford one had one. The city was even nicknamed Pianopolis in some places. And Chiquinha loved her piano, but it became sort of a source of strife between her and her husband. So at some point, it was after the birth of their second child, her husband was assigned to go on this shipping expedition to Paraguay, and Brazil was at war with Paraguay at the time. And so he didn't want to leave Chiquinha by herself at home, so he forced her to come along, and she couldn't bring her piano with her, so instead she smuggled a guitar on board the ship, and she taught herself how to play and promptly began playing music with the enslaved people who were on the ship. And her husband didn't like that. And he said to her, you know, this is enough. I've had enough of your music. You need to choose right now. Is it going to be me or the music? And the story goes, she looked him right in the eye and she said, "Well, sir, my husband, I cannot imagine a life without harmony." So after the divorce, her family unfortunately disowned her, and she had to kind of make her own way. But she became friends with this group of musicians in Rio de Janeiro who were really at the forefront of developing an entirely new style of music, choro, which is it's a combination of sort of European dance forms, say polka, mazurka, waltz, etc., with African rhythms. And it's really interesting. When I first heard this music, I thought, oh, this sounds kind of like ragtime. And well, guess what? Ragtime has similar kind of origins in terms of blending European and African musical styles. And so anyway, you might listen for that in the music that I play for you this evening. So Chiquinha ended up being sort of the leader of her band, and she started writing music. It was incredibly popular. She actually, over the course of her long life, she lived to be 87 years old, and she composed hundreds of pieces of music, and including she composed the music for 77 operettas, which is quite remarkable. She composed the music for the very first carnival march in Brazil, which of course carnival is a very big deal. And she also, outside of her music, she was an abolitionist. She was very active in the abolitionist cause in Brazil, fought against slavery there, and also even donated proceeds from her music to the abolitionist cause. She also fought for copyright protections for artists, partly because people kept ripping off her music because it was so popular. And she actually got to live out her own May-December romance, in which she was December. So when she was 52, she met the love of her life. He was only 16, but they were together for 35 years until she died at age 87. So I'm going to play two pieces for you by Chiquinha Gonzaga. And the first one is actually her very first piece that she ever published, called Atraente, which means attractive or cute. And the story goes, she was improvising, like it was a jam session with her choru band, and she started improvising this melody, and everyone's like, oh, what a cute melody, you should write that up and publish it. And so she did. And because of all those, pianos everywhere, it really took off. And in fact, I mean, you might say it went viral. It went through 15 printings in the first year after it was published. So I'll play you Atraente, and then I'll play another selection, probably her most famous piece. This one is Gaúcho, cowboy, or Corta-Jaca, which is the name of the operetta that it came from. This is a Brazilian tango. And this was composed a bit later, and basically it actually became the subject of it caused at some point a minor political scandal. So Chiquinha Gonzaga actually was visiting her friend, who was at the time the First Lady of Brazil. So Chiquinha Gonzaga was at the presidential palace with her friend. They thought, oh, let's play some music together. Chiquinha Gonzaga gets on the piano, her friend is on the guitar, and they play this Corta-Jaca, and people just had such a fit over this. They were denounced on the floor of Parliament for playing street music in the presidential palace. But you'll see right away why this is still a very popular piece. So I'll play Atraente, followed by Gaúcho or Corta-Jaca by Chiquinha Gonzaga. Thank you. So our second to last composer this evening is Lili Boulanger. She was a French composer who composed in an impressionist style. So she wrote sort of in the early 1900s, essentially. And Lili was also a child prodigy. She was actually the daughter of a composer, Ernest Boulanger, and her older sister, Nadia Boulanger, who was 6 years older, became one of the greatest music educators of the 20th century. But so Lili was extremely talented, especially in composition from an early age. By the time she was 4, she had begun attending classes at the Paris Conservatory, along with Nadia, who was only 10 at the time, to be fair here. Lili was especially taken under the wing of Gabrielle Fauré, who was a family friend, and she also was influenced by Debussy and some of the others kind of composing in an impressionist style at the time. And Lili was in ill health for much of her life, most of her life, in fact. I mean, if you look at the program, you'll see she had a tragically short life. She died at age 24 or 25. And she knew she probably didn't have long to live. And so she ended up focusing her entire being, and all of her energy on composition, on being a composer. And it was her dream to win the Prix de Rome, which was this prestigious award that included a residency in the Medici Villa in Rome, and also was basically a guarantee of publishing contracts and a professional career. And so she set her sights on this prize. Her father had actually won the Prix de Rome many, many years before, and her older sister Nadia had tried, I think, 4 times and failed. But Lili ended up in 1913, at age 19, she became the first woman to win the Prix de Rome. And she went and she began her residency at the Medici Villa in Rome in 1914. Can anyone see a problem with that? So basically, the outbreak of World War I meant that her residency was cut very short, and she returned home after not that long, but she did spend a bit of time there. She actually died in 1918, but she spent sort of the remainder of her life after she returned from her residency continuing to compose and also supporting the French war effort, especially French soldiers who had been musicians prior to the war. So Boulanger didn't actually compose very much, given that, I mean, she had a very short life. And most of her music was written for voice and various kinds of ensembles. But she did write a very tiny bit of music for solo piano, including these Trois Morceaux. And actually so Trois Morceaux means like 3 pieces. And actually the third piece was, I think, originally written for violin and piano, but then transcribed for piano. But I think I'm just gonna claim it for piano right now anyway. The violin version is really cool too. Anyway, so these are absolutely gorgeous pieces. They only take around 5 minutes to play altogether, but each of them is really almost its own entire world. So Boulanger had just a beautiful palette of colors that she worked with. So you'll listen to like lots of different sort of changes in the sound, and she also had a real ear for melody. Like, her vocal writing really comes through also in her piano writing. And you might think it might make you think of other Impressionist composers like Debussy, for example, or Fauré, listening to this, but she also really has her own distinctive voice. So here's Trois Morceaux by Lili Boulanger. Thank you so much. And that brings us to our last composer for the evening and our last piece. I just wanted to say thank you so much for coming out tonight. Thank you so much for being a great audience. It's really been a pleasure. So our next composer, our last composer for the evening, is Florence Price. And Florence Price was the first African-American woman to really gain national and even international recognition for her work as a composer. She was born in Little Rock, Arkansas. She lived in sort of the late 1880s to the first half of the 1900s. And her family was an important part of the Black professional class in Little Rock. Her father was a dentist. Her family was very involved in the cultural life of the city, and they would host all kinds of speakers and cultural events, and her family was, again, very involved in that. Interestingly, some of you may have also heard of, there's another African-American composer, William Grant Still, and who worked around the same time. He was a little younger than Florence Price, but he was also from Little Rock, and his family was sort of in the same social circles, which I find really interesting. They knew each other as children, at least a bit. Florence really wanted to be a doctor when she was a child, but there was really no way for a Black woman at the time to pursue that career path. It was a long time before we might have a Black woman as president. Anyway, so she, instead of trying to become a doctor, it ended up actually that the New England Conservatory of Music actually accepted students of color at the time. And she was able to enroll there in Boston, and she studied piano, organ, and composition, got degrees in all of those. And she went and taught at Clark Atlanta University after that, which is a historically Black university in Atlanta. And then eventually she came back to Little Rock, got married. She and her family moved to Chicago to basically in search of a better life in the 1920s. At that point, however, her husband actually became abusive, and she divorced him, and she was raising their two daughters by herself in Chicago as a single mother in the 1920s. And, but at the same time that her personal life was becoming increasingly difficult by some measures, right, by many measures maybe, her artistic life was flourishing. She was part of the Chicago Black Renaissance. She lived in an artist colony for a time in Chicago in this apartment building with other sort of artists and musicians and writers and so on. And at the time, she supported herself by teaching, composing, and playing the organ at silent films. She gained a lot of recognition for her composition during her lifetime, especially locally in Chicago. In fact, she won this Wanamaker Prize for a couple different compositions that she had, and including her first symphony won the Wanamaker Prize, and the reward for that was that your symphony would be performed by the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. So she was actually the first African-American woman to have her work premiered or played by an American symphony orchestra. Through one of her students, Margaret Bonds, who was also a Black woman, Florence Price got connected with some other really important cultural figures of the time, including the poet Langston Hughes. And so Florence Price actually wrote, she set a number of Langston Hughes poems to music. And she also knew the contralto Marian Anderson. And in fact, Marian Anderson owned a bunch of Florence Price's songs, including her setting of My Soul's Been Anchored in the Lord, which Marian Anderson actually performed as part of her famous concert in 1939 on the Lincoln Memorial Steps. Despite all this recognition, Florence Price really struggled to get her music published. It was probably a combination of racism, sexism, just lack of time to make the connections that she needed, like by traveling or so on. And when she died in 1953 or 4, I forget, somewhere in the 1950s, she basically, it was thought that most of her music had just been lost, like that most of her work was no longer with us. Until I believe 2007, when somebody bought a house outside of Chicago and looked up in the attic, and there were all these boxes full of manuscripts. And it turned out that Florence Price had summered there for many years when she was living in Chicago, and these were in fact some of her unpublished manuscripts that were just rediscovered in this attic. Luckily, the new owners of that house, brought those manuscripts to the university, and people started going through them, and scholars are still kind of going through them and working to publish and reconstruct some of Florence Price's work. So the piece that I'm going to play for you tonight was not published during Florence Price's lifetime. I believe the first time it was published was in, I think it's 1992 or so, in this anthology of music by Black American women. And it's called Fantasie Nègre, or Black Fantasy. And it's basically a fantasia and sort of a theme and variations, essentially, on a spiritual, which is, "Sinner, please don't let this harvest pass." And I would say, that has sort of a spiritual meaning of, talking about salvation, right? Salvation of the soul. But it also, I think, just has a broader meaning, too, of make the most of the time that you have, right? And I think it's especially poignant to me, this piece, because Florence Price dedicated this to her student, Margaret Bonds, who was only in her mid-teens at the time, and she actually premiered the piece. But it was almost like a message to her, right? Like, you have this opportunity, make the most of it, right? It's a beautiful piece. You'll hear sort of echoes of Dvorak, maybe. You'll hear some Gershwin. You'll obviously hear the spiritual. It's a really distinctive and really stunning kind of style, I think, that Florence Price has that will come through in this piece. Originally, there was a ballet choreographed to it, which has been lost. But you can just try to kind of imagine what that might have looked like while you're listening. So this is one of my favorite pieces I've ever learned, Fantasie Nègre by Florence Price, and this is what I'll leave you with tonight. Thanks again. You've been just a wonderful audience.